Before we get started, I wanted to show you a few pictures of what we have been seeing God do in the generations here at One Church TO. Now, this first picture is of our Youth X block party that happened last weekend, and we had 170 students show up to kick off their ministry year. And so I want you to be praying for them. I want you to be praying for their leaders as they make connections with them. The second picture is of our seniors exercise class. On Wednesday mornings, our seniors meet here at 10 a.m. to focus on health and wellness. And it's just an amazing opportunity. We've seen people, as our host said, come from the community to join in this class. So would you be praying for them? And then finally, one of my favorite events, it's called Growing Friendships that our team runs. It's where our seniors and our kids can come together on a morning and participate in community and getting to know each other. You know what, friends? We are so blessed with such a rich legacy. I'm so thankful that we're a multi-generational church that spans 5 generations because we need each other, don't we? We need each other at every stage and phase of our lives. Now, I remember when Skip and I became parents for the very first time. This is a picture of Skip. Our daughter was like minutes old, and the doctor had handed our daughter to him, and he looked panicked. Like, give or take, it'd been a difficult 24 hours probably. He'd seen his partner deliver an actual human, and so he was a little bit frazzled. I felt fine until the moment I remember, maybe an hour after this picture was taken, the nurse said to us, well, I'm going to let you get a little bit of sleep, and I'm going to come back and check on you in a little bit. And then you won't believe it. She left the room, and she didn't take the baby with her. And I remember looking at Skip, and I said, can you believe it? She left us here. We're all alone with this baby. Now, the truth is that you can feel alone with people, or you can feel alone when you're all alone. You can feel alone because something in life has ended, or you can feel alone because something is just beginning. All of us have felt alone before, but loneliness is something we don't want to talk about, is it? Rather, it's something we usually avoid at all costs. When was the last time you asked someone, how are you doing? And they looked back at you and they said, I'm feeling a little bit lonely. It's not something that we want to approach. It's kind of awkward, it's uncomfortable, even shameful, so we hide it. We cover it up, we plaster a smile, we post a photo on Instagram, and we convince the whole world that we are anything but lonely. But studies and experts will tell us that 1 in 2 adults feel alone on a regular basis. Loneliness is such a serious health concern that the World Health Organization last year declared that it was a pressing global health threat, stating it was more detrimental to our health than smoking is. And so today we're going to take a look at what loneliness is, when we see it show up in our lives, where we see it in the Bible, and I'm going to give you 3 simple things we can do to help ourselves or others that we love when we are feeling lonely. Now, first I want us to understand there's 4 major types of loneliness. The first one is this, social loneliness. It's when a gap happens between a person's desired and actual social relationships. Now, the majority of the world experienced social loneliness when we went through the COVID-19 pandemic because there was a gap between our desire for social interaction and what was allowed at that time. The second type of loneliness is emotional loneliness, and this happens when there is an absence of connectivity that comes from our meaningful relationships. Emotional loneliness is why you can be in a marriage and feel lonely. It's why you can be in a room or a family or a group of people and feel lonely. It's why you can have thousands of contacts or followers and wonder if anyone even cares about your life, because there's a gap between your relationships and their meaning. Now, the third type of loneliness is situational loneliness. This is categorized by the experience that we have in seasons and changes in our lives. And today I want to take some time to talk about this one. Now, last week, if you remember, Pastor Jonathan brought us one of his favorite board games, the game of Risk. And he told us that this game saved his life. So if you missed that teaching, you are going to want to go back and find out how Pastor Jonathan's life was saved by the game of Risk. But today I thought I would bring you another game. But I brought you a game that I hate. I hate this game. The game of life. Now, I've never liked this game. I'll tell you why. Probably as a child, I hated being told what to do. And so this idea that we were all going to follow a pre-charted path in life sounded incredibly boring to my 10-year-old mind. But of course I've matured over the years, and I've grown to recognize there is some wisdom in recognizing that our lives are more similar than they are different. It's even comforting to know that we will all go through similar paths in life. The Bible talks about this. In Ecclesiastes, it says, "For everything there is a season and a time for every activity under heaven." There's a time to be born and a time to die. There's a time to tear down and there's a time to build up. There's a time to grieve, there's a time to dance, a time to embrace, and a time to turn away. A time to be quiet, a time to speak, a time to love, and a time to hate. We love this chapter, don't we? We quote it at weddings, we quote it at funerals. It brings us much comfort, but what does it really mean? Well, it was written to a group of people who were grappling to understand how the difficult realities of the world could fit with a loving God who created them, who loved the world. And the author is encouraging them through Ecclesiastes to remember that God loves them. And even though they live in a broken world that's filled with broken things, God goes with them. They're not alone, even when they feel alone, and they can trust God at every stage of their life. And so today, I'd like to take a few minutes to walk through the different phases of life that all of us will go through and the traps of loneliness that we might find in them. But I want to do it remembering that God is always with us, okay? First up, childhood and adolescence. Now, typically, kids will experience the lowest levels of loneliness in a lifetime, but unfortunately, that is changing. See, experts are reporting rising loneliness among our kids and our teens at levels we have never seen before. While they're still facing the typical social challenges that you and I would have, they're also navigating loneliness traps that we didn't have, like growing up during a pandemic that disrupted their social development. But there's an even greater reason why our kids are struggling with loneliness, and experts are all on the same page that it has to do with this. Now, before you come at me with your pitchforks, I want to admit I have an iPhone. My partner would say I'm addicted to my phone. I'm a parent who has kids who often have one of these in their hands. And as much as I would love to not look at the data, it doesn't mean that it doesn't exist. Now, earlier this year, there was an investigation into the collapse of youth and social mental health. And it was released in the form of a book called The Anxious Generation. Now, in this book, sociologists and psychologists looked at what the reason is and what the connectivity is between teens and kids and loneliness, and the rise of it due to the constant access of our digital worlds that are pulling our kids away from real life interactions. This is what the author says in the book. Gen Z is anyone that was born in 1997 to 2012. So right now, they're either 12 to 27 years old. So if you're in that age group, you are Gen Z. Gen Z became the first generation in history to go through puberty with a portal in their pockets that called them away from the people nearby and into an alternate universe that was exciting, addictive, unstable, and unsuitable for children and adolescents. By designing a fire hose of addictive content that entered through kids' eyes and ears, and by displacing physical play and in-person socializing, these companies have rewired childhood and changed human development at an almost unimaginable scale. Now I wonder, how many times have you been in a situation where you feel uncomfortable, you don't know everybody, and so what do? Well, you reach for your phone, you open it up, pretend to check something so that no one else will think you're a loser in the room. Friends, isn't it interesting that the device that you and I reach for when we feel alone, the device that experts would say we self-medicate with, is the very thing that is causing the next generation to experience the greatest levels of loneliness we have ever seen in history. But there is some good news, and that is this, that relational proximity is prioritized in your childhood and teen years. This means most kids and teenagers will spend face-to-face time with their friends almost every single day. And this intense physical proximity, is why loneliness is still lower than more stages in life. So if you love a kid or you love a teenager, you want to prioritize physical proximity for them. Offer to take them to Starbucks. Buy them the drink that they want. Enforce no tech zones or times in your house. Allow them a break from their phones. Open up your home to their friends. Fill it with snacks. Fill it with activities like board games and other things that they don't need tech to use. Drop off your students on Friday nights here at the church so that they can make some real face-to-face interactions with their peers and their mentors. Now, the next stop I want to look at is young adults. Now, young adults is where it's at in life. I've learned this. I've been a young adult. I'm no longer a young adult. But young adults is where it's at in life. And usually they do pretty well. But there are a few little traps in young adults of loneliness. First of all, your young adult years are the first time you probably move away from home. Or if you don't move away from home and you still live with your family, you're now responsible for your own self. And because of this new phase of responsibility, we can see levels of loneliness start to show up. And they usually have to deal with your family of origin. But for the most part, loneliness in young adult years is usually so much lower than any other phase of our lives. And the reason for this is that in your late teen and early young adult years, you classify anyone that you know as a friend. And if you have this many friends, it is difficult because there is that interaction to always feel lonely. Now, another notable reason why loneliness is probably lower in this phase is that romantic relationships are prioritized. It's higher in these populations, and that fights against loneliness. So while young adult years can be lonely for some, we do recognize that they are much less lonely than many of the other stages in life. But young adults, don't get too comfortable because I have some bad news. Experts tell us that loneliness will peak in your 30s, and there's a few reasons why. Now, the biggest reason is that by your 30s, disappointments have kind of started to set up in life. If you had rose-colored glasses on, by your 30s, you probably have taken those rose-colored glasses off, knowing that life is full of difficulties and disappointments. And sometimes those difficulties compound in a way that can intensify our experience of loneliness. Another reason why we see loneliness increase is that in your 30s, this is a typical age where people welcome children. And let me tell you, raising children is exhausting, especially those early years. Parents, think back to those early years, little sleep, navigating new schedules, figuring out childcare, figuring out how you're going to feed these kids. It leaves little time for oneself and your own social interactions. So if you love someone who is in their 30s, what you want to do is you want to show up for them, even if you don't think that they want you there. You want to show up for them. If they're a young parent, here's a great piece of advice. Do not ask them about their baby. Everyone in the world is asking new parents about their baby. You want to ask them about them. How are you doing? How can I help you? Send them a gift card to purchase some food. Instead of asking them to come out with you on a night out that's going to require intense amount of juggling, ask them if you can show up at their house and bring some snacks. Now, one more reason we can see loneliness show up in our 30s, and really actually in any other stage depending on your life choices, is when people live farther away from their family and their home. See, if people are going to move away or live abroad, they often will start to do it in their 30s, pursuing professional or personal opportunities. But living away actually takes away from things because you miss out on some of life's milestones and moments. Now, this past summer, Pastor Dan, who oversees outreach at One Church TO and Global Focus and our global workers, he and I sat down with many of our global workers. We heard from 2 of them earlier in this gathering. And quite a few of them shared with us how difficult it is, especially in those early years, to be away from home and miss the connection they get with their family and friends. This is one of the reasons, through that learning, that our community groups here at One Church TO will be adopting our global workers in this next season so that we can combat loneliness and show up for them in community. So if you love somebody who lives away from home, make sure you work hard at connecting with them. Send them notes, Send them messages, send them care packages, schedule a weekly phone date with them so that you can show up in their lives. Maybe use your annual vacation time to go and visit them in their new home. Recognize they are going to experience higher levels of loneliness, but your presence in their life will actually alleviate some of that. Well, if you're still with me, we're at our 40s and our 50s. And I have really good news, because loneliness in this stage tends to come down from that peak that we saw in the 30s. And one of the reasons is that these years, we've established some social circles. We have a clearer understanding of who our friends are at this stage. And our friendships are actually determined not by who is all around, but by how many problems and crises we have navigated together. See, long-lasting relationships and shared experiences actually offer a protection and a barrier against loneliness. There's also less stress, I'm told, in your 40s and your 50s compared to the prior generation and the future years that you are heading into. See, if you had children and you're in your 40s or 50s, typically these kids are old enough that they don't need your constant one-on-one attention all the time. And this just gives you some space to actually have a social life of your own. But I do want to highlight one big loneliness trap that shows up in your 40s and your 50s and even your early 60s. And it's called the sandwich generation. Now, the sandwich generation is anybody who has parents that are 65 plus years of age, as well as children who are 18 or younger. Now, these individuals will find themselves in the role of a caregiver for both generations that they are sandwiched between. And caregiving is one of the areas where experts note we see loneliness show up the most. It's important to recognize that these people are spending most of the time, their own time, with people who are likely not going to meet their own social needs. And so a gap will start to be created, and it will be widened for people who are in a caregiving role. And this will lead to feelings of isolation and loneliness, even if they are with people every single day. So if you love someone who is experiencing the sandwich generation, or you love someone who is in a permanent caregiving role, you can help combat their tendency to feel loneliness by showing up in very similar ways that you would for a young parent. You want to ask them how they are doing. You want to offer them some practical support, like, I will stay with your child, or I will go and visit your aging parent so that you can have an afternoon off. You want to call and ask how they're doing. Check in with them. Ask if there's any errands that you can run for them that would alleviate some of the burdens and time that they have invested into the caregiving role. And then there's one more final stage I want to look at today, and that's 65 plus. Now, in the later 60s, experts tell us we often see another peak of loneliness at this stage, and it's attributed to our relational and our physical losses. See, on average, in your late 60s, your health can start to become a challenge, which has the potential to limit some of your social opportunities. Many people in their 60s are supporting their aging parents, and as they approach their 70s and get into their 70s, they often become the oldest living generation. And all of this will contribute to feelings of isolation and feelings of loneliness. And so outside support becomes crucial at this stage. It's vital that they know that there is a community outside of them that is caring for them as well. But it's the 80 plus generation where we see the highest levels of loneliness recorded in a lifetime. And it's a result of a loss of independence that we all will go through that comes with this stage of life. See, those in their 80s may experience an incredible loss of their health. They may be experiencing the loss of their friendships as their friends pass on. By age 80, many will have already said an earthly goodbye to their partners, or they are preparing to over the next decade. And this compounded season of loss and grief, paired with the changes that they're experiencing in their mobility and health, will greatly contribute to their loneliness feelings. And so if you love someone who's 65 plus, you want to be there for them. You want to recognize that even though parts of their lives are being minimized or shrinking, their need for companionship and relationship is not. In fact, it's probably growing. So you want to remind them of their importance and significance in your life. You want to remind them that God has not forgotten about them. One of the most beautiful encouragements I think you could give to anyone 65 plus and older is this. It's a promise from God, and he says, I will be your God throughout your entire lifetime. Until your hair is white with age, I made you, and I will care for you. I will carry you along, and I will save you. Friends, this verse should be an encouragement to all of us because we have all gone on that path of life. All these loneliness traps I'm talking about, we all can find ourselves in some of them. And as these loneliness traps happen in life, as life's difficulties start to compound, it builds towards the last type of loneliness that I want to look at today, and that is chronic loneliness. Chronic loneliness happens when loneliness becomes a way of life for someone. I'm going to invite you to open your Bibles to Genesis 11. If you've spent any time in a church, you probably have heard some of these stories before. It's about a guy named Abraham and a woman named Sarah. There are these great matriarch and patriarchs of the Bible. The entire family can trace their beginnings back to them. If Sarah lived in 2024, I am certain she would have had an Instagram profile. Probably would have looked something like this. She was beautiful. And like most of her Instagram feeds, it would have painted the picture of her life, but not really told you much of her story. Because Sarah lived through some incredibly lonely seasons in life. Lonely seasons that lasted decades. Now, her name, Sarah, actually means princess. It was given to her by her birth family. And I imagine a wonderful childhood for Sarah, growing up knowing she was loved, cherished, and mattered. I imagine that decisions were made in Sarah's best interest. And then at some point, she marries this guy named Abraham. And if they're anything like any of the young couples I know, like the young couple that we were, they probably had some bumps and challenges in life. I'm sure that there were some hiccups as they went down the path of life. The Bible doesn't tell us much about it, but it does say this. The name of Abraham's wife was Sarah. Now, Sarah was barren. She had no children. You know what? I have journeyed through life with many people who have lived the reality of this statement. And I wish that this was not a reality that was a part of our broken world, but it is. Childlessness today, like it was in Sarah's day, is a heartbreaking reality for many individuals who desire children. And this difficult reality would have shaped their marriage. In those days, barrenness was seen as shameful because there were many false teachings, very false teachings going around, that barrenness actually meant that a deity or a god was disapproving of you. And so she would have struggled. Sarah would have struggled in her mind. She would have struggled as she was surrounded by her family and friends who were welcoming children. They lived in this close-knit community. There would have been kids all around. I imagine it would have been a very difficult reality for her. I imagine she would have felt very alone as her womb remained empty. And though I've personally never experienced brokenness, I have experienced emptiness in my life. I'm sure we all have. Emptiness that is caused by an absence or a lack of someone or something is a difficult journey that we will walk in this life, especially when others around us have the things that we so deeply desire. It causes us to feel as if we do not measure up. And emptiness is a breeding ground for jealousy and shame to set in. And these feelings will cause us to retreat, to pull back, to pull away from others, which only increases the loneliness that we experience in life. So shortly after being married, in the middle of her lonely journey of childlessness, Sarah's husband Abraham announces that they're going to move. And God has told this to Abraham: leave your country, your people, your family's households, go to the land that I will show you. And so Sarah trusts God. And so she packs up their life. She says goodbye to her community, all that she knows, all her friends, all her family, the sounds, the tastes, the smells of home. I imagine if she has not already experienced chronic loneliness, she probably is experiencing it now. Not to mention they're not moving down the road. Their new home is going to take them years to get to. And as they go out on this journey, shortly after they start out, we read that they decide to stop in Egypt because there's this great famine that's going on in the land. See, Egypt can provide the food that they will need, but it's going to come at quite the cost. Now, there are parts of the Bible that I wish were not there. I wish we didn't have to read them. But today we are going to read one of them. But before I do that, I want to note Sarah was very beautiful. Abraham recognized that his wife was very beautiful, and he knew that if he went to Egypt with Sarah as his wife, all the men in Egypt were going to hate him because they couldn't have her. So Abraham does something that seems unimaginable. Abraham says, "Please tell them you are my sister. Then they will spare my life and they'll treat me well because of their interest in you." Sure enough, when Abraham arrived in Egypt, everyone noticed Sarah's beauty. When the palace officials saw her, they sang her praises to Pharaoh, their king, and Sarah was taken into his palace to live with him. You can read between the lines. Then Pharaoh gave Abraham many gifts because of her: sheep and goats and cattle and donkeys and servants and camels. Friends, I can't imagine how alone Sarah must have felt in that season of her life. She'd been the beloved daughter of a family, and now she was being treated as a tool instead of a treasured partner. And I think this is the aspect of loneliness that is incredibly ugly, when the state of someone else's loneliness is caused by someone else's actions and choices. Experts will tell us that the presence of loneliness will be exponentially increased when any type of discrimination, bias is present, including gender, racism, ageism, or sexual orientation. This means that when others choose to illuminate or discriminate based on another person's gender, age, sexual preference, or race, those people will be forced deeper into the pain of loneliness. And so because Sarah is a woman, and a beautiful one at that, she's forced deeper into her state of loneliness, now living with compounding chronic loneliness. And it's on this tapestry of loss and pain that God shows up and makes an incredible promise. The very promise that leads Sarah to become the great matriarch of the Bible. God says this: "Look up into the sky, count the stars if you can." I love God, if you can. That's how many descendants that you will have. Now I can imagine that these words are like a balm to Sarah's weary soul. It's in this verse that I think we can find the first thing that we can do when we find ourselves in a lonely season, and that's find perspective. Now, during one of the darkest moments of Sarah's life, God invites them to look up at the sky. And I think there's a reason why God turns their attention upwards towards the sky. See, often in difficult situations, especially lonely seasons, it's easy for us to get laser focused on our own problems. Our own problems become so incredibly large, and they take out any perspective that we might have been able to generate on our own. So God calls Abraham and Sarah to look up, to consider the vastness of the sky, to try and count the stars and recognize it was him who has created it all. Because he is the creator of the universe, he can be trusted even with their most difficult and painful circumstances. You know what? Yes, it's true. They cannot conceive a child. Yes, it's true. They have been displaced from everything that they know. Yes, it's true that life has not gone the way that they wanted it to. But it is most true that God created the world. It is most true that he designed the stars to hang in the sky, that he spoke the vastness of our universe into existence. And there God is, right with them, caring deeply about them, promising that he is going to work out the broken areas of their life, asking them to trust him. See, if he could hang the trillions of stars in the sky, certainly he can do what he promises to do. Friends, when we are in difficult situations and experiences, it is very important for us that we figure out how to get perspective. And we do that as followers of Jesus by turning our eyes to him, by reading God's word, by reminding ourselves of scriptures that remind us of who he is. As Pastor Jonathan said last week, reminding ourselves that even if we feel alone, we are never alone because God is omnipresent. He is everywhere. He is with you, and he is with me, and he is with everyone around this world at all times. Now, I wish I could tell you that Sarah's story gets easier after this part, but it doesn't. See, Sarah does give birth to a son 25 years later. She's 90 years old. But Sarah unfortunately makes some very unwise choices before that day when she welcomes her son. And these unwise choices further complicate the loneliness that she is experiencing, which is really important that we find wisdom when we're in seasons of difficulty. See, I think the difficulties of life, the loneliness had stacked up on Sarah to a point that she just wasn't thinking clearly. I've been there. I can relate to that. It had been a few years since God had made the promise. Nothing seemed to be happening. So Sarah, looking at her situation, decides nothing's happening. I'm going to take matters into my own hands. So she invites her maidservant, whose name is Hagar, to sleep with her husband Abraham so that they can produce an heir that way. Now, this is a common practice that happened in those days, to take on a maidservant to build an heir for the family. Because in those days, they did not have the wonderful technology and advancements and variety of options that we do to build a family. And I'm so grateful for so many medical advancements like IVF because I have watched God use these pathways to bless people with children. I've also celebrated the gift of adoption and watched God place children that I love in loving families. And friends, if you are in a season where you're trying to build a family and it's a little bit difficult, I would encourage you to consider these pathways. God uses these pathways in today's world. But in this instance, when Sarah invites Hagar to carry an heir for her, this is not what God had promised or planned. God had been clear that he wanted Sarah and Abraham to put their trust in him to fulfill the promise of a child in his timing, not on hers. He didn't need her help. He only needed her trust. This is why we need wisdom that guides our steps. We need wisdom outside of ourselves. Perhaps if Sarah had sought any other type of wisdom, she may have not made the decision and took a matter into her own hands and only complicated her grief and loneliness, because Hagar does become pregnant. And Sarah has to live through another very difficult journey of loneliness as they welcome Hagar's son into their family. Friends, in seasons of loneliness, we need outside wisdom. We need outside counsel to help us make our decision, and it comes in the form of counselors and therapists and medical professionals who have expertise to offer us the best possible wisdom. It comes from trusted mentors and spiritual directors, and it comes from a community who knows us and loves us well, which is why the final thing we can do in a lonely season is to find some circles. See, when we go through difficult seasons, we are tempted to believe that we are all alone, which is not true. Sarah was tempted to believe she was all on her own. She had to make it happen herself. When we go through these types of seasons, sometimes the last thing we want to do is reach out and connect with others. But it is the thing that we need most. Galatians says, carry each other's burdens. And the only way for someone to come alongside and help us carry our burdens is for us to share with others what we are going through. To admit, I'm feeling lonely, I'm feeling alone, and I need some help. That's why we believe in groups so much here at One Church TO, and you're going to hear us talk about it because we don't want anybody to go through the journey of life alone. Now, what I love about these simple steps is that they are also the same way you help someone who is lonely. If you know someone that is lonely, there's 3 ways you can help them. The first is this: you want to offer them perspective. See, when someone we love is going through a lonely season, we need to remind them that they are not alone. We need to help turn their eyes away from their problem and turn them to who can help them, which is God. Just like David writes throughout the Psalms, in our most difficult seasons, we need to be reminded of God and his character, that he loves us, that he's for us, that he has gone before us, and he will help us in the future. When I think back most on some of the most difficult and painful and lonely seasons of my life, the most lonely seasons, the people who showed up and helped me develop perspective are the ones who actually helped me the most. And they were also the ones who offered wisdom to me. See, when people are struggling, we need to make sure that the counsel that we are offering to them is wise. People who are struggling do not need someone else to commiserate with them. When I was walking through that difficult, lonely journey that I think about, I probably was drawn to the people who wanted to sit in the pit with me and talk trash about the people who had got me there. But those were not the people who helped me. The people who helped me most were those who got into the pit with me, but told me to look up and helped give me wisdom so that I could actually climb out of the pit and move on with my life. And ultimately, those are the people that I am most grateful for in that season of my life. So if you are loving someone who is going through a lonely season, make sure that your words are wise, not further wounding to them. Read scripture with them, pray for them, because they need wisdom and they need community, which is why when someone is struggling, the best thing, the easiest thing I think you can do is to offer them a circle. Offer them what they need. They need a community around them to support them so that they know that they are not alone. And we can do this simply by keeping our eyes open, by having an extra chair available in our house, in our community group, at church, wherever we are, so that we can pull people up and say, hey, come sit with me. You don't have to sit on your own. By taking opportunities that God places in front of us. A long time ago, when my kids were very little, I was pushing a stroller. I went out for a walk, and I think I had 2 or 3 of them at the time. It was a crazy time of my life. And it was in the afternoon, and I remember bumping into this gentleman. And he was an older gentleman, and so I smiled at him, he smiled at me, he said something about the kids, and we started talking, a very simple conversation. It was nothing profound or big. We talked about the weather, about the things that kids do that are so funny, and we just had about a 10-minute conversation together. And at the end of the conversation, as we were wrapping it up and saying goodbye and walking away, he stopped and he grabbed my hand, and he said, I wanted to thank you. He said, this is the first conversation that I've had all day, and you've made my day. And then he continued to tell me that he loved to go on afternoon walks because he lived alone, and sometimes it was quiet and it was lonely, and so he would go on a walk to find someone that he could talk to so that he would have community throughout the day. Friends, it's true we are in a loneliness crisis, but I think we have the tools that can help combat what other people are going through. I think loneliness can be lessened by a smile. I think loneliness can be lessened by a conversation, by the presence of someone else in our lives. I think loneliness can feel less lonely when we help people find perspective, find wisdom, and find circles to join. I believe this. The solution to loneliness is us. We have the power to open up and lift up our eyes. So next time you're on the bus, next time you're walking down the sidewalk, I would encourage you, open your eyes and look around at the world around you. Talk to someone. When you're standing in the store at the cashier line, engage in conversation. Send a message to a friend who you know is struggling. Stop by and just bring them food. Don't ask if you can. Just bring it to them. Open up your circle. Invite someone else to join in your community. Or better yet, start a new circle. Create more space so that there's more community for people to engage with. Friends, I think as we do this, I really believe that this is how we become the hands and feet of Jesus to the world that he loves. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the reminder of Sarah's life, God. I thank you that in her lonely moments, God, in the moments that we can all relate to, that you were always there. You never left her, God, and you are there for us too. Today I recognize, God, we recognize as a community that you created the universe, God. You hung the stars in the sky. You made everything that I can see and I can hear. God, you are aware of every detail of our lives, and you love us, and you come close. God, I think of my friends who are going through lonely seasons right now, and I ask that you would help them. Would you give them the courage to admit to someone, I'm feeling lonely? Would you give them the courage to embrace vulnerability, God, so that others can step in and carry their burdens with them, God? Would you lead them into seasons where their loneliness would be lessened because of the community that you place around them? And God, I think of all of us, and I ask for you to help us see the loneliness that's around us. God, would you give us your eyes? Would you give us your heart, God, so that we would deeply care about those in our life, in our community, who are walking painful, difficult journeys? God, help us to carry the burdens of others by willingly offering our perspective, God, pointing them to you and giving them wisdom, God. God, as we sang this morning, would you show us who you are in our lives, God? Would you fill us with your heart? And then would you lead us to those who are around us? We are so grateful for your presence in our lives, God. In your name, amen.